Okay, why don't we begin? Sorry for the delay. We're looking at A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we've got 2 classes to get through the rest of it, so we're a little bit behind the 8 ball here. Last time I spoke about the different levels on which the plots work in the play and different types of characters. Sorry, let me just close that. That there were 4 different types of 4 different plots intertwined, just to refresh your memory, and there was a hierarchy therein. The plot line between Theseus and Hippolyta, a high style of comedy, that of the lovers, the human lovers who occupy most of the time. So those are Hermia and Lysander on the one hand, and Helena and Demetrius on the other. On the 3rd level, which is the level of burlesque, really, the low comedy, that is of the commoners. They will chiefly present their thinking in the play within the play that they are seeking to perform as a part of the wedding ceremony. Remember, this is going to be performed for the Earl of Southampton. So at a wedding ceremony, for a wedding ceremony, so it's fit for the occasion. And then finally, and as a parallel to all 3 of these, there is the fairies operating in the background with Oberon and Titania, the king and the queen, as it were, of the fairies. And in that, and I said something about this last time, but I wanted to expand upon it, because one of the things that has been observed, and I think somebody in the class said it, but I can't remember, it might have been a conversation I had afterwards, is that this is a really weird play. Maybe it was my wife that said that. As a comedy, it's a very strange play, because it's not like, what is going on here in this play? It clearly is a comedy, but it's too complex to simply be a comedy, and there's too much going on in the play. And my contention is that Shakespeare in this play is engaging in a Renaissance humanist debate over what art does. And in it, he is presenting different views from different vantage points. Let me backtrack a little bit, and then I'll expand on that. So Renaissance humanism, I need to say something about this. I think Shakespeare is a Renaissance humanist, but I need to explain what is meant by humanist, because humanist or humanism in the Christian community is almost only a pejorative. That's colored by 19th century influences, I would say romantic influences, where humanism is a human way of looking at things as opposed to God's way of looking at things. So man-centered as opposed to God-centered. That's the usual in a Christian community. That is the sort of standard vocabulary there. And that seems to me to have lost it's first of all, it's a caricature of what humanism constitutes humanism, and it certainly does not reflect the humanism of the Renaissance, where there's a great deal more complexity. In Shakespeare's age, it is connected to the Renaissance, or rather the ancient word humanitas, which has 2 meanings, 2 distinct meanings. Firstly, it refers to mankind in a general sense. The word that humanity derives from that. We still use that word humanity. So that just refers to the creatures. That's uncontroversial. The second aspect, which is a translation of the Greek word paideia, which you've heard me use a fair bit if you're in a few of my classes, is the Greek word for culture or liberal education, which it takes to develop a man into a responsible adult. It's all of those things. And the epic is, in that sense, encyclopedic. It's there for the purposes of paideia. It makes a person cultured, and cultured not in the 19th century sense of a snob, but in the sense of a civilized human being who knows how to act properly. So it's the process of education. It's what you get in a liberal arts education, or what you ought to get in a liberal arts education. It's moral training, among other things. But it's more than that. I'll come to that in a sense. But this sense of man, which of humanities and therefore of humanism, is there in the Renaissance, the Italian and the English Renaissance. And Shakespeare is, of course, working within the confines of the English Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance is in the 14th century, with Petrarch and Dante and so forth. We had a little bit of a look at that if you've done first year English. But now we're in the English Renaissance, and the English Renaissance is furthermore, and it's concurrent with the Reformation. And the Reformation, of course, also has a theological dimension to it, and they can be distinguished, but they flower at the same time. So there's an attempt to take human beings and to educate them the way God would want them to be educated, and not necessarily the way they have been historically. So there is, to some degree, a backlash against tradition, against the authority of the church, and in another sense, there's an attempt to go back to sources, and Cicero being the primary one. So Cicero is taken as the great hero of the Renaissance, English Renaissance. But a humanist is in England is a classical scholar who has two aims. One is to recover the moral values of a classical life, and to imitate the language and the style of the classics as a means to do that. Therefore, they read the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid in particular, because the Renaissance focuses on the Latin texts. Later humanists will go back further to the Greeks, who are the great role models for the Latins. But the English Renaissance is largely a Latin-based Renaissance. So he wants to imitate and recover the moral values of classical life. Obviously, not all of the moral values, because Christianity has changed the assessment of life, among other things, so that the unborn have value. Those who have been abandoned for death, set on the street corners, exposed to the elements. They're not wanting to replicate that view of the moral life. But there is something of the classical model of moral behavior which they see in the text, and they learn it through the text. So there's an emphasis on the literature. And the other thing is that they are going to learn the language and the style then. They regard the style as a means of the substance. It's a vehicle for it. And with this, then, they want to unite two things, wisdom and eloquence. I'll use the Latin words. Wisdom is sapientia, and the Latin for eloquence is eloquentia. That's close enough, I guess, if you want me to write it down. Wisdom and eloquence. This is the aim of education for the Renaissance humanist. And in our day, you might have heard of the classical education movement. It's quite large in the United States now, and it's growing here in Canada. I started a classical school here in Toronto myself. Wisdom and eloquence are the aim. These are humanist aims. Humanist not in the sense of against God, but humanist in the sense of seeking to recover the aims of Renaissance humanism. I could say more about that, but I think that's when it comes to that, this is what is going on here. There, in these four-part plot structure. Theseus and Hippolyta represent the aristocrats. There's a type of education there, there's a type of imagination at work there. There's a complexity to their understanding, a sophistication, a learned understanding of things. The lovers are your common day people, maybe your merchant class. Remember when Shakespeare's, if you think about Shakespeare's Audience, I haven't said much about that, but if you go to the Globe Theatre, have you ever seen the Globe Theatre? No? Has anyone actually been to the Globe Theatre either? Anyone here? No? Okay, so let me see if I can find an image of the Globe Theatre and put it on the screen here behind me. The Globe Theatre was burnt down, but it was rebuilt, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 30 years ago? Maybe not even that long ago, by an American actor. And it's right on the Thames now. It's quite spectacular, but it was rebuilt exactly in accordance with the model, for trying to make it as precise as it could. Globe Theatre. Images. So there it is from the outside. So you can see it looks old. Oh, you can't see it looks old. You can't see a thing. There you go. I can see that it looks old. So just trust me, it looks old. It's very old. Isn't that right? So this is it from the outside. Oh, go on. Is it up there yet? Still not. So I'll just wait. No, it'll come in a sec. But more importantly, from the inside. And if you've seen, what was the Gwyneth Paltrow movie?
Oh, Shakespeare in Love.
Shakespeare in Love. That's shot in the Globe Theatre. So if you've seen that, you've seen the theatre. That's the rebuilt theatre, which is slowly coming up behind me. That's why I wanted this up and running before I got in here. So I'll get rid of the Sapientia and Eloquentia and Humanitas. And I will even kill the lights. There we go. So you can see the stage here, and here where the players will perform, and the commoners will be down here right at ground level. That's where the common people watch the play. And they're crowded at standing, and they're crushed up against the stage, as many as you can pile in there. And then there are these, in the round, other boxes where people with means can purchase their seats. So these would be the merchant class and so forth. Now there's always, as in almost every theater, a place for the aristocrats and so forth. There's a box for the queen, should the queen wish to show up for a performance. And these will be the discrete members of Shakespeare's own audience, and he has all three of these different types of audience members in mind when he writes his plays, and he has a little bit for everybody. So when he's making fun of the commoners, this play within the play, he has these folks in mind. They're not educated, but there's something for them there. They find it funny. They are being poked fun at. They find it humorous. They're not offended. It's a joke. They take it as such. But it's put on that most basic level, and I will say the most carnal level. So it's toilet bathroom humor, like Dumb and Dumber type stuff, right? Pyramus and Thisbe, the play within the play, and where the ass turns into, she's going to kiss the donkey and so forth, and everyone's laughing. Kiss my, yes, exactly. That's low humor. Okay, but that is for precisely that group of people. Now, in accordance with Shakespeare's view of hierarchy in politics, they are part of the body politic. They're also moved by their passions. They don't have an intellectual sense of anything. That doesn't mean that they're not human. Shakespeare has a great deal of love for the English common people. But they're not the ones that are in charge, and they're not the only members of his audience, but he has something of it there. He's not only aiming for the aristocrats when he's putting on a play. He has also has the idea that it is his responsibility as a playwright to educate everybody and meet them where they're at, to use the jargon of our day. Like, at what level can you appreciate this? How can I reach you? So he's doing that there with the commoners, the play within the play. And then there are those, the regular, the merchant class, which are probably will pay more and will have a seat as a consequence. And those would represent the lovers. But then there's the Theseus and Hippolyta types, the aristocrats who are ruling. They ought to have a more sophisticated understanding of things, a more literate one. And so he will use allusions to classical texts and contemporary debates, philosophical and theological and so forth. And you'll have that spoken by them out of the mouths of the aristocratic characters. And in that they will advance different theories that abound in the Academy, which Shakespeare seems to be aware of, because they are part of his debate. So he is a playwright. He's in the trenches, as it were, writing plays and acting upon them, etc. But he is also engaged in the scholarly debates of the day. Not that he's going to universities, but he's aware of what is being said in the Academy, because men like Ben Jonson, a fellow Renaissance dramatist, is a classicist. He's a contemporary of Shakespeare. Shakespeare knows his stuff. Although Jonson said of Shakespeare that he was, although brilliant, a little bit too loose with his adherence to classical models. He's a little bit too, takes a few too many liberties. He said worse about John Donne. He said, what Donne has done in rhyme deserves flogging. So that's the classicist. Whereas Shakespeare was wildly popular. So was Jonson. But Jonson was the classicist. Shakespeare was less so, but not without his knowledge, and he shows that off in his plays. So there's a conflict, as we saw last time, this conflict between eros and social order. Eros in the sense of lust, the passions, and social order, reason, if you will. A clash there. And they're taken as extremes. There's no way that this discord can be breached. The reasoning side, represented by the father, wants to put down the erotic love of the daughter. The daughter wants to express it. She wants to love whom she chooses to love. That's her choice. That's what she wants. Shakespeare sees both positions as tyrannical and discordant and impossible, and they need to be reconciled. How are they going to be reconciled? Because the people in authority are themselves subject to a kind of moral blindness. And legalism, all they can do is appeal to the law. And the laws of Athens are only going to allow one outcome, which is that she has to listen to dad, or else. Now, we saw last time that what was interesting about the ruler is that he allowed for another out, which is that she could go into a nunnery. So he has taken a little bit of liberty there and allowed for the possibility, but he has recommended what he ought to recommend, the father's counsel. You should marry the man your father has chosen for you. But if you don't, you can go into exile, or you can go to a nunnery. As I said, we left off last time with the ridiculous scenario whereby the daughter was left with her choice of lover, and then they decide that they're going to elope effectively and get married somewhere else. Well, I mean, that's not like a tyrannical father who is absolutely not, I'm going to make sure you do what I want. He's not going to leave her alone with the guy she said you can't be with. Like, that's not plausible. But anyway. And then when they're alone, of course, they come up with a plot to get around the legalism of the father and his tyranny. And that's where we more or less left off. But we didn't get to the subplot. Now, the subplot in Act 1, Scene 2 is there with the common people. Now, Act 1, Scene 2, and we are introduced to figures like Quince and Bottom, the very aptly named Bottom, Flute, Starveling, and so forth. And their dialogue is just ridiculous. It's short, it's almost incomprehensible. These are common characters. They're going to present the play Pyramus and Thisbe, about two lovers who live next door, separated by a wall. The parents prevent them from even communicating with one another. They talk through a little crack in the wall. They go into the woods to be united. And in the end, after a few misunderstandings, they commit suicide. Now, that is the play they want to put on. It just happens to mirror the plot in Act 1, Scene 1. And so there's an expectation or a fear that arises in the audience that it could be the outcome of what the two lovers have just decided is the wise course of action. So the threat of tragedy is already there simply by virtue of the subplot.
What about Helena and her...
Who?
Helena.
Helena.
Who is in love with the guy that...
Demetrius.
With Demetrius that Hermia is supposed to marry.
Yes.
So that just sort of throws in a sort of love triangle aspect of things, and she kind of plays in because she doesn't want Hermia to marry him either, right?
No, there's a lot of... so Shakespeare uses something, and we'll use this term repeatedly. He uses foils. So he'll have one character and then have another character. This character is very similar to that character, and you can compare them and contrast them, and sometimes they are very, very similar and not that different. Sometimes they're totally categorically opposite, but you still see the one as illustrating something about the other. And in the case of Hermia and Helena, one of them is short and dark, and the other is tall and fair, blonde-haired. I'm not sure if there are any connotations that go with the dark, short, and the tall, blonde. It's just they look totally different. That's it, I guess.
But isn't it also, sorry,
No.
a case of subservient versus, like Helena's a very subservient character. She wants to do what's right and good, but Hermia is sort of more confident and bold in her.
She is.
It is so like.
And
so
Helena
they're
also
mirrors
sounds like
each
Helen
other,
of Troy, right?
Yeah. So while they're mirrors of each other, they're also sort of like the good side and the bad side in some ways, or the moral and immoral.
Maybe one seems more compliant and obedient, and the other seems more rebellious. Yes. So does that represent something there? It probably does. But in a sense, Shakespeare is not suggesting at the outset of the play that there's a right position here per se. Because the father, it's not just that the daughters have problems, the father has a problem. They're both off. They're both, the way they look at things is problematic. There are no good characters at the outset. They're all subject to some form of corruption or discord. Right? So we can't say this is the hero. They're all, I'd say, quite complex characters in some ways. And it's not clear, he's not coming on one side, well, Helena's the superior creature because she's an obedient one. That's not, he doesn't suggest that even, right?
He adds in characteristics like she's very self-deprecating.
Right.
And
yeah, she's unsure of herself. So she's obedient, but she's also unsure of herself. And she puts herself down, whereas Hermia seems to be quite self-confident, and she's not going to be told who she should love. I'm not going to be told by you. I will love whom I wish to love. Shakespeare makes us sympathetic towards Hermia, and at the same time, we're not totally with her, because we can see that her judgment is more that of will than a reasoned, he's better, actually. It's just, I choose him. Well, that doesn't mean it's going to be good for her in the end, right? And so the audience who has that perspective of not being in the play is sympathetic with her, because in part because her father's just such a monster, but at the same time not totally with her, because she's not Lizzie Bennet, right? She's not this virtuous heroine. She has her flaws. They all have their flaws, and that's part of Shakespeare's message in general in his comedies, even in his tragedies. Characters are flawed, and over the course of the play, through the action that ensues, they will be remedied in some ways. If it's a tragedy, the bad guys are going to die, and sometimes a few good characters as well, but then there will be some sort of unity going forward. In the case of a comedy, the discord will be reconciled and harmony will ensue, and there'll be a marriage, or marriages. And the characters who were sort of off-center in some ways at the beginning will have learned, they have been taught through experience that their initial responses were not right. So he's teaching in the play the characters. The characters are learning, and so is the audience. So the audience is learning by example, and this is Shakespeare's conviction, which is the conviction of old, that people learn by imitation. They delight in imitation themselves, in creating things and imitating life through their words, and their actions. They enjoy doing that, but they also enjoy watching others do it, and they learn by imitating others, their superiors. And Shakespeare, as a Renaissance dramatist, regards it as his duty to instruct all of them. So in a sense, there is no public education in Shakespeare's day. There's no public school system. The play is the public school venue. All come in to the play, and will get it in the English language in a way that they would not get in the Catholic Church at any rate, but they would get in the Protestant Church. It's being spoken of their English sermons and from an English Bible and so forth. But that's another aspect of it. But so there's the common people who are represented by the appetites, the lower aspects of human nature. He does not so deplore the lower aspects of human nature that he is going to just say, they're unreformable. He wants to reach them. So in a way, the stage is part of the Reformation. Not that it didn't happen in the medieval period, it did, but it becomes a vehicle for humanist thinking. Yes?
Education was much more Aristotelian at that, wasn't it? In the sense of
no. Yes, and that's not Aristotelian. The schoolmen, as the Aristotelians were called, were common in Catholic circles. But the humanists despised Aristotle and everything that the schoolmen represented him as, and they started their own schools. So along with Luther came Melanchthon, and Melanchthon brought in a school system in Germany that has perdured to this day. And again, it was for all. It was not just for the aristocrats. The aristocrats always educated their children. Now education was offered more broadly to even the common people. They also ought to be able to read the Bible and benefit from it. And they ought to hear from the Bible in their own tongue and benefit from it. So there's a democratic appeal there even in humanism. Even while humanism harkens back to the Latin language, there's also this sense that all people are made in the image of God, and they all ought to be reformed.
Why didn't they design stages in the style of the Greek or Roman? Because they
didn't have the marble. I don't know exactly, but it's cold in England, and they don't have marble. But the Athenians, those theaters are carved out of marble. And they also, I would say, they probably didn't have the architectural knowledge to create the acoustic environment of the classical age. The classical age is extraordinary. The Roman aqueducts exist to this day. They still stand. If you go to Rome, you can actually see them. And so do their roads. They're still there. So the knowledge there probably doesn't even exist in the English Renaissance. that may be the reason. The other is, as I say, the cold. You want something that keeps the wind and the rain off you, although again, you can see the roof is open here, so when the rain comes during the performance, which it does, these folks are getting wet. And these folks are under the cover a little bit. They're a little bit drier and a little bit less subject to the elements. But you can imagine putting on a play and then having a rainstorm erupt. I've been in the Globe when that happened, actually. It was, they carried on. I wonder if they would quit I'm sure they would if it got extreme enough, but while I was there, they carried on even in the rain. It's quite impressive. Anyway, I just think it's interesting to see how the theater in Shakespeare's day reflects Renaissance humanism and also the Reformation. At the same time, there are those in the Christian camp who want the theater shut down. Famously, they want the theaters to be closed. It's not only because of what goes on in the theaters, it's what goes on around the theaters. What happens in the theaters is that this is a gathering place for prostitutes. And all manner of things arise out of that. Venereal disease, birth outside wedlock, etc. And so they oppose the theaters because these are gathering places for iniquity. It's not just the depictions on the stage, although some oppose that as well. And Shakespeare will take his pot shots at those who hate the theater and what it does, and to some degree feels the need to respond to those who charge those who put on plays with being immoral and of peddling immorality, encouraging it. He sees a better role for the arts than that. Yes?
So how did they feel about the Queen having her own private booth then?
They wouldn't like it much.
Because she's the defender of the faith.
By that point, yes, she is. Yes.
So how do they reconcile that conflict?
Well, they think the Queen shouldn't, and they lobby her and give her grief over it. And she will either listen to them or ignore them. But those who are particularly zealous want the theater shut down, and they succeed at times. So some of the Puritans concerned with public morality and the consequences of it. As I say, their point is well taken in a sense. As I say, venereal disease, children outside wedlock, and the children are not looked after then. And these things happen there. But at the venue, is this really going to stop it? So we close down every alehouse in England and every theater, and will that stop sin? We'll come to that when we come to Measure for Measure, in which that question is directly raised. And we see a young man who is austere and probably represents the Puritan spirit, Angelo, who's so pure that he has never sinned, and he's going to crack down on the bawdy houses, the prostitute dens, and prevent it from happening. And we'll come to that when we come to it. But Shakespeare's, to some degree, he's speaking to his audience when he puts these plays on. These are live political issues in his day. But back to Act 1, Scene 2. So the play that they propose to put on ends with Pyramus and Thisbe committing suicide. And so there is a foreshadowing, a dramatic foreshadowing of something that may well happen to what we just saw in Act 1, Scene 1. So that's there, and it's running as a subplot alongside of it. So it could be Hermia and Lysander could be facing the same outcome. Now, the actors here are ruled by the imagination. I talked about the imagination. The Elizabethan view of the imagination is either that it is just madness, and that's when it really is only carnal. It's only ruled by the passions, and it's a sort of divine madness over which there's no control. It's irrational. That's the sense that that Bottom and his friends represent. That view of the imagination. I talked about different views of the imagination last class. Bottom and his friends represent that view. So Bottom is worried that the audience will believe the play to be real. He's really worried about that because they'll take it literally Like, how will they be able to? Like, we're going to say this, and of course they will believe that. He's very worried about this, that people will take things literally. Why? Because he himself takes things that way. He's incapable of seeing things in two ways. There's no irony. And of course the audience finds this hilarious. But Shakespeare is really parodying a way of reading or misreading, misinterpreting. I can tell you right now that even small children know when something is fake or fictional and not real. They might ask occasionally, but that's because they're aware, hold on, he doesn't mean what he says there, does he? Bottom is not capable of what a small child is in that sense, and he doesn't think anyone else is. He's worried about this. So he represents that view of the imagination. Wholly irrational. Wholly literal as well, which is interesting. And he's worried the audience will believe the play to be real. And this is a parody. They're parodying the idea that the imagination is key in theater, which Shakespeare himself holds. But a different view of the imagination. The other thing about Bottom is that he is a huge narcissist. His view of himself is quite extraordinary. He believes that he can play every character. A one-man show. So vain. Bottom is an ass. So that's where the subplot begins, Act 1, Scene 2. Act 2 moves on to the realm of the fairies, whom we have not yet met, with Puck coming in, speaking to another fairy, and then Oberon and Titania, the king and queen of the fairies, entering the scene. Now, these fairies are figures of fantasy. Fairies have acquired more credence in our day than they once did, largely because of Tolkien and his use of what he called fairy. I dealt with that in our sci-fi subcreation course last year. And it's a realm of not pure fiction. There's something real to it. Tolkien ascribes some validity to it, and so does Shakespeare. He is not wholly discounting it. There's a realm of beings that exist outside of human beings that operate upon human beings. Not just angels, but other powers. Now here he's tapping into English folklore, as I said to you. But he's also dealing with, in terms of literature, with the genre of romance, the supernatural. So Oberon and Titania, let's talk a little bit about them in that sense. They have godlike powers. They can even control thoughts. But they often do it through means, like they have charms and so forth, natural substances. They daub them on their eyes so that they can see things. But they can seem to be able to read minds as well. On the other hand, their commands often go astray. So they're not omnipotent. They have some powers that exceed our normal capacity, so they're supernatural in that sense, but we mustn't confuse or conflate them with God, because they're not that. They're powerful enough to do very good things and also to mess things up in a spectacular way. So the fairies and Act 2 and this realm of the fairies is interesting because they transport the audience's perspective, and when I say the audience, the entire audience, to a realm that is beyond the human. It exceeds that of a mere Renaissance playwright speaking. A more global perspective. They're capable of doing things and seeing things all over the world in an instant. Really is a godlike power. Now, Puck himself speaks of the myth of the changeling. And that seems to be something, have you heard of the myth of the changeling? So Titania, the queen of the fairies, had snatched a baby from its cradle to bring it up as her own. There are a lot of horror movies that have been over the last few decades about the changeling. And this is an old English myth, that a fairy comes and sees a baby and takes the baby and steals it away and adopts it for one of its own. And that's the myth that is being alluded to here. And apparently she's done exactly that. Now, for some reason, Oberon wants the baby. And it's unclear why that is. It's never made clear. And it seems like he wants it simply because he wants it, to demonstrate that he's in charge. That's about it. Pure willfulness. But having said that, her desire to have the baby seems equally willful. There's no real reason for it either. So both of them, although they are supernatural in their power, they seem to be expressions of will without any goodness to them. They have power, but they're not really moral characters. So they're not to be looked upon as role models. They are just powers. So Puck, as I say, speaks of the changeling myth. And Oberon wants this baby, and that is the source of discord amongst the supernatural beings. So there's discord everywhere. Just because we're in the realm of the supernatural doesn't mean that there are good things happening there. There are powers at work, and they are in conflict with one another. And that will be something that drives the plot as well. The supernatural discord will carry over into the natural realm. So they mess things up even more so. Now, Oberon, to further complicate the plot, is in love with Hippolyta. And Titania is in love with Theseus. So the two human characters we met at the outset, the king of the fairies loves the queen of the Amazons. The queen of the fairies loves the king who subdued her. So that's a further complexity. Now you can see the foils being set up here. Pairs, pairs, pairs. None of them love one another as they ought to. All of them seem to subdue one another through some form of violence. The audience is aware of the tension. They can't help but be, because there's open conflict. So this jealousy between the two, because they don't love one another, they love someone else, brings about a disruption in the natural order. Now, so these are natural deities, Oberon and Titania, with supernatural powers. But the discord is reflected in natural things. So Oberon uses natural charms to overcome the conflicts between the lovers which he observes. And he orders his servant Puck to fix the problem. And of course, Puck screws up the commands and he creates even worse conflicts. And then the question is, does Puck mean to do this? And the answer is yes and no. He delights in it at any rate, but does he intend it? I'm not sure that he does. He's not a wicked figure. He's not an evil figure. He's more a figure of anarchy. He's not the Joker, right? He doesn't delight in watching things burn. He delights in seeing things frustrated and laughing, just like the audience. People find this is why comedy is funny. There's expectations, and then there's actually what happens, and it's embarrassing. He delights in the embarrassment. Yes.
It's a bit of modern day troll,
like an internet troll.
Just mess with things just to mess with them.
Enough just to watch people go, ah.
Enough to get people frustrated, but
Yep.
not intentionally to hurt people.
Right.
As soon as someone actually gets hurt, trolls they don't want any part of that.
Maybe not. They back away and
Yeah,
let's
they
step
go
back a little bit. Yeah.
Or like someone who likes to watch people fall down on YouTube.
Oh gosh, there are a lot of those. Like those YouTube.
Self-admittedly, I'm one of them.
I can watch that for a little while.
It's quite funny sometimes.
Yeah. The Darwin Awards are popular for a reason.
Right.
Yeah. So yes, that explains his delight. There's a delight in the misrule. And he seems to delight in bringing it about, but he almost seems to do it accidentally. Do we believe that? Does he intend it, or does it just happen? If it was too deliberate, we would regard him as an evil figure. He's a little bit too complex for that. So Puck screws up the commands of Oberon, which suggests that Oberon is not as all-seeing and all-knowing as he purports to be. Or he's complicit in Puck's sort of mischievous, let's just do these things and then we'll fix it up after it's done. He's playing a little bit. There's a playfulness. Now remember, all of this action is going to take place in the realm of the forest, where reason does not hold sway, where the imagination rules, where discord is the rule, more or less. On the other hand, he's observing the king and queen that are in Athens. So it's not that he's confining his vision to the forest. Yes, Jaden.
Is it possible that Puck doesn't find enjoyment in the failure of the plans, but just his own failure to enact?
He sort of, I don't know. He seems to, yeah. It's possible.
It's him that messes them up.
He likes it.
And maybe it's just that he is able to see.
We can't think of him as a human figure. I think that's the main thing. He's an impish on every front. It's not, his status is not even clear. But again, he has superpower as well. But the idea that Puck comes from English folklore. Robin Goodfellow. This is English folklore. And the audience will be well aware of this figure, and they will already be delighting in what he's going to do. Because yes, they mess things up, but boy, is that ever funny. So somebody tries to sit down in the chair, somebody's pulled the chair away, and then they fall to the ground. Everybody laughs. Sometimes you do it intentionally. A little brother does it to a little sister, or vice versa. I've got kids. Or you do it yourself and you forget that you've took that away, and you just fall down and everybody's laughing, including the person that's fallen to the ground. Right? So things that happen unexpectedly are funny. It's a little bit of that, but again, how quickly does somebody falling down become somebody hurting themselves, and that's no longer funny? Or it is funny until the point where it goes beyond they've just hurt themselves. And Puck does not seem to be able to rein that in, and Oberon does and seems to wish to. So there's a discrepancy there between the two. Puck is not just an aspect of Oberon. He is an independent character, and he seems to operate independently. So Oberon has in his power the ability to create a rational love between characters, even not just an irrational one. So not one that just simply relies on their passions, but even one that is related to a genuine appreciation of the other. So that's why he doesn't just represent bodily anarchic forces. That's why I say he's supernatural. He's not sub-rational. On the other hand, he uses his power to degrade his queen, Titania. Makes her fall in love with the very first thing she sees, which is, of course, Bottom. The most ridiculous character in the play. In the end, it becomes an ass, right? And so his own queen is kissing the ass, right? And of course, that play on ass is anyway. In English, they say arse and not ass. So I don't know if it quite has the same. We laugh because it only has one sense, but so that Oberon escalates the discord. He pushes it to its extremity before it gets transformed back into order. And this is what happens in the forest. So what is discordant in Act 1, Scene 1 becomes further and further discordant. And the subplot of Act 1, Scene 2, which suggests that suicide might ensue, we have a strong sense that can be the outcome here. because discord is increasing, not decreasing. And Oberon, the king of the fairies, is responsible for it. Now, the effect of Oberon and Titania, the forest, the nocturnal setting, is that delusion is the rule. The reason does not function. Your eyesight betrays you. It doesn't operate there. And the emotions are magnified. When you're confused, you become emotional. And your imagination is also heightened. So again, when you're in the dark at night, you have nightmares. Why don't you have daymares? Seriously. One is you're tired. When you're tired, the physical aspect of you, they call it the reptilian brain now, right? That seems to have greater sway than when you're rested. But again, it's also, you're in the dark, you can't see, so you can't think. If you can't see straight, you can't think straight. And your imagination runs wild. That seems to take place here as well. Even without the influence of the love charm, Helena debases herself to the point of masochism, all on her own. Whereas Demetrius becomes aggressive to the point he's clearly misogynistic. He really hates her. He wants, he'd give her a good kick. And she's happy to take the kick. She, kick me harder, right? Make me your spaniel. Beat me. Types. Like, this is all on their own. Now, this is in the forest. This would not have taken place in Athens. So he becomes aggressive towards her, and she likes the aggression. Thinks it ought to be worse.
In a place of high respect than to be used as your dog.
Yeah, use me as your spaniel. What does that mean? Give me a whack, I guess. And then that happens again without any influence of the supernatural. That is just what seems to happen in the forest. There's a degeneration of human nature. And not just a degeneration in the sense of capacity of their own self-worth. They despise themselves and they despise others. So the hatred is growing. So in Act 2, Scene 2, when Helena and Lysander and Hermia all fall asleep, Lysander rather chivalrously sleeps some distance from Hermia. Puck comes in and assumes that Lysander has scorned Hermia because of the distance between them. This was incorrect. It was chivalry. But he sees the two of them. Oh, they're upset with one another. And so he anoints Lysander with the love charm. He awakes and becomes infatuated with Helena, which he was not supposed to do, of course. And she, of course, thinks that Lysander is mocking her. So the effect of this is not a good one. She is outraged. Now you love me. Well, you are just doing this. And Lysander, in his delusion, believes he's now seeing reason by choosing her. So instead of the two lovers going into the forest and we're going to get wedded, now they're totally at odds with one another. Now he sees reason in choosing Helena over Hermia. Heavy irony. Shakespeare's message is that the light enables the reason to function. The senses to reason, actually, and to function properly. The light here then has, I would say, even theological implications. Jesus being the light of the world. The darkness likewise has the same negative connotations. It's almost demonic. It turns people into monsters. Now, Hermia's explanation for Lysander's absence is that Demetrius has slain him. So there's a buildup of deception, self-deception, deceit of others, and conflict, and violence threatens everywhere. And so the parallel, as I say, that was mentioned in Act 1, Scene 2 of the story of Pyramus and Thisbe becomes more and more plausible. as we spend time in the forest. And this is characteristic of Shakespearean drama. There's a sort of a build-up, a crescendo, and it resolves itself. And so there's a 5-part play. Act 3 is the pinnacle, and it gets resolved in one way or the other. But it's always resolved. Shakespearean plays resolve themselves. If it's a tragedy, the bad characters are killed. Sometimes a good character dies along the way. That can happen. But a concord, some sort of unity results. That's in a tragedy. In a comedy, it resolves itself not in death, but in marriage. But there's always a resolution to the discord. It begins in discord in both cases. There's a problem. And the problem builds and builds and builds and builds, and the plot and the subplot work to have a dialogue amongst them. And different sides and aspects of the theme are fleshed out by Shakespeare through different characters. And they get to this pinnacle, and you're wondering what's going to happen now. And in some plays, it's entirely unclear what's going to happen. We'll see in Measure for Measure, a problem play. It ends with a marriage, but it doesn't seem a very happy ending. It's a funny old conclusion to it. Yes?
How do the histories resolve themselves? As history plays?
More historically, in the sense that they follow. We're not doing any of his history plays. There are a lot of history plays. It depends on them. In the case of the tetralogies, the English history plays, there are 4 set alongside one another, and they need to be seen in the light of one another. It's almost like part 1, 2, 3, and 4. So Richard, that you would watch Richard II, and then Henry IV part 1, and then Henry IV part 2, and then Henry V. Those 4 plays need to be seen consecutively. Because what happens to Richard, the bad king, he ends up being replaced by Henry V, the good king. And the conflict that results in an English civil war is only resolved by Henry V when he goes and puts down the French at Agincourt and so forth, and this English nationalism. So that's the way you see that. So there's a discord in Richard II, and then there's a unity in Henry V. So it's seen across the plays rather than within a play. That's why the plays aren't as good to watch as a one-off. Whereas a tragedy and a comedy, you can see it all in front of you, and it's a complete thing. So as a work of theater, as a work of art, the history plays are not as satisfying.
Is that how they would have been performed? Would they have
I don't know, actually.
like this night and the next night?
No, I don't think so. No. They might have been at one point, but they certainly weren't written that way, so that they were all performed one after the next. So this build-up of deception and conflict in the play and the threat of violence could mean that it's teetering towards tragedy. It's hinting at it. The expectation of tragedy looms, and that is precisely what allows the comedy to be so satisfying, the resolution. This could have ended far differently. Likewise, in a tragedy, we'll see this, there's a suggestion that it might just be averted, that the tragedy might, like the good guys are coming, they might just get here in time, and then they don't get there for some reason. Something distracts them, something prevents them, some new element frustrates them, and tragedy ensues. But it's always in Act 3. That's a characteristic trajectory in Shakespeare's comedies and tragedies. So the parallel between the lover's plot and the Pyramus and Thisbe story is enhanced here. And Oberon and Puck, when they realize what has happened, they try and correct their mistake, and they give Demetrius the love charm. And he falls in love with Helena then. Puck seems, and he's not a human character. He does not seem to be subject to human emotions. He's a bit like Cupid, the blind servant, shoots his arrow, hits randomly, discord ensues. And when I say that, it's because his mistakes seem to have the same effect as Cupid's. People fall in love randomly. When you say Cupid is often portrays a blind being. Now, when it comes to these scenes, and I'll let me talk about Act 3, Scene 1, and then I'll talk about the way Shakespeare's language enhances his themes here. Shakespeare is building what we're going to call discrepant awareness. There's a discrepancy between what the audience sees and what the characters see. The characters have, or the audience has a better understanding of what's going on than the characters themselves do. This allows them to enjoy what they're seeing. They're not confused. The characters are confused. The audience is not. They're observing people that are, or characters that are like them, and yet they're able to see it from a distance, more objectively. And then they're allowed to reflect on how they themselves are prone to make the same sort of mistakes as the lovers have here, for the same silly sorts of reasons, and then to come out of it, let me not do that again. So this creation of a discrepant awareness allows Shakespeare to teach. If they only were involved in the entertainment and they were totally enthralled by what they were seeing, the teaching would not happen to the same degree. But because there's a distance, he can function as a Renaissance dramatist and be a teacher as well as delighting his audience. He's teaching them. And Shakespeare would see both functions as necessary to be a good dramatist. You must teach and you must delight. In our day, we tend to think of the theater as only delighting or entertaining. And that's partly because we have thrown morality out of the square of the entertainment industry. Morality, don't impose your values on us. The problem with this is that there's always values are always being taught. It's not possible not to teach values. So if you've thrown out the values, you're effectively teaching moral relativism and anarchy. It's not a good outcome, by the way, socially. So, discrepant awareness. Let me come to Act 3, Scene 1. By this point, the dichotomy between the intellectual and the carnal has gone to its extreme in two figures. Bottom, who represents man's lower nature, his carnal nature, and Titania, who represents the intellectual and spiritual aspect of human nature, even though Titania is not a human being, but she represents that spiritual aspect of mankind. The more angelic side, if you will. And there's an attempt at unification there. Now it is a very forced one. It's a ridiculous one. He is no more fit for her than she for him. This is not a good unity. It's a unity that only takes place in the forest. In human life, you will never meet a Titania marrying a Bottom. That doesn't work. And they're not attracted to one another either, or they ought not to be. But that is what happens here in the forest, an attempt at a unification. Now this emphasizes the absurdity of the duality in human nature. Our bodies, being just like the animals, we need food, we need creature comforts, and yet there's an aspect to human nature which is godlike. Willing to put aside self-interest, loving others ahead of ourselves, willing to sacrifice for the sake of the good of others, of our children, of even our enemies. That aspect, those two things, the one totally self-absorbed and the other not, that those two things don't fit together. Except that they do, because Jesus took on a body. But here they're portrayed as separate, opposite things. That doesn't fit. By the way, the union between Bottom and Titania does not ennoble Bottom. It doesn't make him like her. It makes her like him. This is always the case. And Shakespeare's teaching something here. He's teaching us about a wide variety of things here. He's making a political statement. So he's speaking, although he's not intending to do so because he doesn't live in such an age, but he's speaking against modern egalitarianism, that everybody's equal and the same. He would never hold to that view. It wouldn't even occur to him, although it does occur to some, the levelers, who will come again 50 years after Shakespeare, but those who regard all human beings as the same in all distinctions and all hierarchy and all rank. This is an artificial imposition and ought not to be there. Shakespeare would not agree to that. He says if you seek to impose equality, all you do is degrade the noble, but you don't ennoble the base. Titania is degraded. We don't find Bottom to be elevated. That's the effect of imposing equality. It just degrades the good. I see it all around us. Although there's not much good that can be degraded anymore. But there's no. This is why we delight in the fall of the celebrities. Like seeing people come down off their high horse, even if the high horse is not their ambition or their pretension. It's just they're good people and they fell down. I like that. So one of the more disgraceful aspects of human nature. But he demonstrates how lust brings out the animalistic side of human nature and overcomes reason and the godlike. That is what happens here, this forced union. So the lower cannot bring the higher down into equality. It has to happen the other way around. Reason must rule over the passions. But not in the way it was suggested in Act 1, Scene 1. That's tyranny. It's going to have to be a better form of union. And that will only be able to work itself out through the imagination that takes place in the forest. Yes?
Can you repeat what you said about lust? Sorry.
About
lust?
Lust. Lust brings out the animalistic side of human nature. So if you think about the great chain of being with God and the angels and man and the animals, and in some books I could probably get an image here online. At any rate, in the portrait of this, man is seen as having these two aspects. It's the animalistic, the bodily aspect, and then the angelic aspect. It's a comparison. It's not actually a statement of belief. They don't actually think that we're part angel and part animal. That's not what they're saying. There's a tendency of human beings to act below their station. There's a tendency to act superior to it. It pulls in both directions. They note both tendencies. When it does so, they're called to be like God, but they're not called to be like this. So this is particularly degrading. Yeah, sure. As demonstrated in Orwell's Animal Farm, where equality is promoted everywhere. Right? We're going to bring about equality. Well, what results in that? A degradation of everything good. That's the 20th century, this century of mass murder. That's the legacy of the 20th century, mass murder. More people murdered by war and other means in the 20th century than every other century put together before it. Mass murder in the name of equality. unsurprising that people are murdered when goodness is scorned. So the duality in human nature is exposed there. As I say, it doesn't ennoble bottom, it simply degrades Titania. And Titania, while she speaks in noble tones, she falls prey to lust herself, and in the end falls in love with an ass. A donkey, an animal. Kissing it, putting hair, flowers in his hair. How beautiful you are, and it's ridiculous. And of course, Oberon wills this. So you're thinking, what's with Oberon here? Come on. And it's all to get this baby. I think I probably ought to leave off there, or have I got 1 minute? Oh no, it's not accurate. So I've got 5 minutes, yeah. So in Act 3, Scene 2 then, because Act 3, Scene 1 begins with quince and snug and bottom and flute and snout and starveling. And then enters cob and mustard seed and so forth. And the play and the ridiculous dialogue between them, and it really is ridiculous. Absurd. Gives way to Act 3, Scene 2, where there's in a clearing in the wood, Oberon appears. Oberon asks the question, I wonder if Titania be awaked. Then what it was that next came in her eye, which she must dote on in extremity. Now, as I say, Oberon is capable of seeing things from afar and even reading people's thoughts, but he seems not to know what has happened to Titania. Are we to believe this as accurate? I don't see how otherwise. He's not being disingenuous. He doesn't know what's happened. Now Puck comes in. Here comes my messenger. How now, mad spirit? What night rule now about this haunted grove? Puck, my mistress with the monster is in love. And he'd be giggling. Next to her close and consecrated bower, while she was in her dull and sleeping hour, a crew of patches, rude mechanicals that work for bread upon Athenian stalls, were met together to rehearse a play intended for great Theseus's nuptial day. The shallowest thick skin of that barren sort, who Pyramus presented, in their sport forsook his scene and entered in a break. When I did him at this advantage take, an ass's knoll I fixed on his head, anon his Thisbe must be answered, and forth my mimic comes. When they him spy, as wild geese that the creeping fowler eye, as or russet-pated choughs, many in sort, rising and cawing at the gun's report, sever themselves and madly sweep the sky, so at his sight away his fellows fly. And at a stump, here or one falls, he murder cries and help from Athens calls. Their sense thus weak, lost with their fears thus strong, made senseless things begin to do them wrong. For briars and thorns at their apparel snatch. Some sleeves, some hats, from yielders all things catch. I lead them on this distracted fear, and left sweet Pyramus translated there. When, in that moment, so it came to pass, Titania waked, and straightway loved an ass. This falls out better than I could devise. But hast thou yet latched the Athenian's eyes with the love juice as I did bid thee do? I took him sleeping. That is finished too, and the Athenian woman by his side, that when he waked, of force, she must be eyed. Okay, so now Demetrius and Helena approach. Just comment on this. They are speaking here in tetrameter. More obviously poetic, and in rhyme at that. More obviously poetic, more obviously artificial to the audience. It's conspicuous, and so it seems enchanted. It's the language befits the characters here, but it doesn't befit in the sense that they're working discord. But this seems to be precisely what Oberon wants. What Oberon does not realize is that even here, Puck has, while he appears to have done a good thing, has set in gear a serious problem that could threaten, could result in death. So at this point, Helena's self-doubt becomes uncontrollable, and she can't believe that both Demetrius and Lysander love her, and she wants neither of them. So confused, so distracted, so distraught. And Hermia, Act 3, Scene 2, line 177, I have in my notes, reveals what's happening here in the forest in a prophetic statement that she doesn't understand herself. I'll just read it and then we will conclude with this. Dark night, that from the eye his function takes, the ear more quick of apprehension makes, wherein it doth impair the seeing sense, it pays the hearing double recompense. Thou art not mine eye, Lysander found, mine ear, I thank it, brought me to thy sound. But why unkindly didst thou leave me so? So she is here brought to not to understand what is ensued here. So again, the discrepant awareness in the audience about what's actually happening. There's irony in her statement, and Oberon and Puck are going to have to intervene and apply Diane's bud to and Diana, the goddess of chastity, to Lysander's eye to restore him back to where he was. So they're having to keep wiping everybody's eyes over and over. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try that again. And now it's farcical. So now the king of the fairies is as ridiculous and absurd as the lower characters. So in the forest, there can be no rule. Disorder is everywhere. They'll have to come out of the forest. Anyway, I'll pick it up next time.